Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Hadith 227 from Sahl ibn Sa'ad. It is his statement when he says that I have seen the men tying up their buttons at the neck area, just like the children would, because the clothing was tight, and they were praying behind the Prophet, and a man called out to the women, O group of women, do not raise your heads until the men have raised. So in this narration, we learn that the clothing of the men would be quite tight, and so they would do their button up so that their awrah would not be exposed. And this goes to show us that it is permissible to pray in tight clothing, that the prayer is correct. However, what is better is to pray in loose clothing, which does not show the shape of your body. And this applies to men and women. However, if you pray in tight clothing and it covers the awrah, then the prayer is valid. And the reason why the person would have said to the women, don't raise your heads before the men do, is because the women are praying behind the men, and if they raise their heads before the men, then it could be that their glance would come upon the awrah of the men, which may have been uncovered. Inadvertently, of course, because the clothing they were wearing was tight and short. Let's not forget that they did not have the luxury clothing which you're used to nowadays. They had very basic clothing. We also take from this narration that the men and women would pray in the same hall, and we discussed this previously when we talked about the best rows for the men and the women and the worst rows for the men and women. Nowadays it's not really a problem because men and women have separate areas for praying, and it is separated by a wall or a curtain, or indeed it may even be a separate building, and that's fine. Hadith 228. This is about women going to the masjid for the Salat al-Jama'ah. From the father of Salim, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا اسْتَأْذَنَتْ أَحَدَكُمْ إِمْرَأَتُهُ إِلَى الْمَسْجِدِ فَلَا يَمْنَعْهَا. When the wife of one of yours seeks permission to go to the masjid, then let him not prevent her. And in a narration, a man called Bilal ibn Abdullah said to Ibn Umar, Wallahi, we will surely prevent them from going to the masjid. And Ibn Umar started to speak ill of this man in a severe fashion. And he said, I am informing you what the Prophet said, and you are now saying to me, verily we will prevent them. We learn from this narration that firstly, the woman seeks permission from the husband to go to the Salat al-Jama'ah, and it is upon the husband, if he does not have any valid reason, to allow her to go to the masjid, because this is what the Prophet ﷺ has ordered us. Having said that, of course, the houses are better for them, because the closest a woman is to the mercy of her Lord is in the depths of her house. And so for her to pray in the house is better, but for her to go to the masjid is permissible. As for the Salat al-Eid, the Prophet ﷺ ordered the women to go out. So the Salat al-Eid is more emphasized for the women to go to the Musalla of the Eid. As for the narration, where Bilal ibn Abdullah says that we will surely prevent them, his intention was not to oppose the hadith of the Prophet. Rather, his intention was that nowadays the women do not go out properly concealing themselves. Maybe they have perfume or other things which are not fitting. Therefore, we will surely prevent them. So his intention was noble. It was not to oppose the Prophet, but we see here that Abdullah ibn Umar was extremely strong when it comes to the Sunnah. He does not want to hear anything, even a slight hint of opposition to the Sunnah. That's how severe he was in following the Sunnah, and his love of the Sunnah is ever so apparent. Normally, the women of the Sahaba would go to the masjid for the Salat al-Isha and the Salat al-Subh, because this was the dark time. They would not normally go to the masjid in the daylight hours, so for Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib, because the night time is more concealing for them. And so this is closest to the Sunnah, that we say it's permissible to go to the masjid, but strictly it should be Salat al-Isha and the Salat al-Subh, because that's how the women of the Sahaba would do it. Further evidence that they are allowed to go to the masjid, the Prophet saying, لا تمنعوا إماء الله مساجد الله. Do not prevent the servant women of Allah from going to the houses of Allah. But the condition is that they must be properly dressed, of course, and in particular there must not be any perfume on them. The Prophet ﷺ said about the woman who goes out with perfume, أيما امرأة استعطرت ثم مر بقوم ليجدوا ريحها فهي زانية. Any woman who puts on the izaar, meaning the perfume, and then she passes by some people and they would smell the perfume from her, then she is a fornicator. And this hadith is authentically reported in the Sunan, and the reason why the Prophet says that she is a fornicator, or we may translate it to prostitute, is because her actions have tempted the other men, and this is the exact nature of a fornicating woman or a prostitute, is to tempt the men. So this is why she is not allowed to leave the house with the perfume. And the Prophet ﷺ said about this, وَلْيَخْرُجْنَ تَفِلَاتٍ, and that they must leave with no perfume on. This is authentic in the Sunan. Likewise he said, أَيُّمَا امْرَأَةٍ أَصَابَتْ بَاخُورًا فَلَا تَشْهَدْ مَعَنَا الْعِشَاءَ الْآخِرَةَ. Any woman who puts on bakhur, which is a type of perfume, then she must not attend the last Isha with us. And this is where the women of Bani Israel failed, and they were prevented from coming to the masjid. As Aisha radiallahu anha in this same chapter narrates, if the Prophet saw what has happened to the women now, and she's speaking after the death of the Prophet, she says he would prevent the women from going to the masjid just like the women of Banu Israel were prevented. So, for example, you could find that a woman is wearing the hijab and the jilbab and so on, but at the same time her face is showing and she has makeup on. So this completely defeats the purpose of the hijab. Or for example, she's covering the head, but she's wearing tight trousers. And again, this completely goes against the spirit and the nature of the hijab, which is to cover the body obviously with a material which is not translucent, but also it must not be tight so that it shows the shape of the body. So this is the issue then, that the women do go to the masjid, they are allowed to do so, but on the conditions that we have laid out. And there could be much benefit in women attending the masjid. They could organize da'wah for the females as well, and they could get active in the community in terms of the women's side of da'wah. As for the ruling on allowing your wife to the masjid, or any other female under your authority, then the rule here is that it is wajib to let them go to the masjid, unless there is a genuine need preventing you. For example, it may be that the road or the route to the masjid is dangerous, or some other genuine pressing need. Hadith 229 from Abdullah ibn Abbas, he says about the statement of Allah Jalla wa Ala, وَلَا تَجْهَرْ بِصَلَاتِكَ وَلَا تُخَافِتْ بِهَا, and do not recite the Salah out aloud and do not keep it quiet. He says this was revealed in Mecca because the Prophet, when he would lead the people in prayer, he would raise his voice out aloud, and when the mushrikun would hear this, they would abuse the Quran or speak ill of it. And also the one who sent the Quran down, meaning Allah, they will abuse him as well, and they will also abuse the one to whom it was sent down, meaning the Prophet. They would abuse all of that. And so this is why Allah Jalla wa Ala ordered the Prophet to not raise his voice up too much, but also not to keep it quiet. Because the point is that the ma'moom must hear the recital. So this is why Allah orders him, وَابْتَغِي بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ سَبِيلًا, but seek a middle way in between. Aisha radiallahu anha says about this ayah in Surah Al-Isra, that this was revealed pertaining to making dua. Now, unless she intends by the dua the salah, we would have to say that the opinion of Ibn Abbas is closer to the truth because it is more apparent. Meaning to say, it is apparent from the wording of the ayah that Allah Jalla wa Ala is speaking about the salah, meaning the official salah, not just merely the dua. So we take from this narration then that the Muslim must prevent the means which make it easy for the kuffar to abuse this deen. So for example, Allah Jalla wa Ala orders us, do not abuse or speak ill of other people's religions, because they will abuse Islam then in return. So the Muslim must do whatever it takes to prevent exposing Islam or the Quran or any aspects of this deen from being abused. What if somebody is already abusing this deen? Now we have to take a look here. And it's a sensitive issue because sometimes if you try to prevent them, then they may just increase in their abuse because of their arrogance and their heart being hardened. So in a case like this, you leave them be. Sometimes trying to prevent them could lead to them gaining extra media attention, and so they would become even more popular. So you have to look at the results of your actions, and many a time it could be a good idea just to leave them be, because it's not like they're going to stop abusing this deen. Hadith 230, the statement of Ibn Abbas about the statement of Allah, وَلَا تُحَرِّكْ بِهِ لِسَانَكَ, and do not move your tongue with it, meaning in order to make haste in reciting the Quran. He says that when Jibreel would bring the wahi, or the revelation, to the Prophet, he would move his lips and his tongues fast in order to recite everything that was recited to him, and of course this was difficult upon him to keep up with. And Ibn Abbas says that this difficulty could be seen on him, meaning in his body language. And so Allah sent down the ayah, do not move your tongue in order to make haste with it. Inna alayna jam'ahu wa qur'ana. Verily upon us is to gather it together, meaning in your mind, and the recitation of it, to enable you to recite it properly. So Allah Jalla wa Ala is saying that it is upon Allah to make you memorize it, so to collect it in your mind, and also to make you recite it. فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَهُ. So when we have recited it, then follow the recitation. So don't recite at the same time, rather just be quiet, don't move your tongue or your lips, just listen. Inna alayna bayana. Verily upon us is to make it plain. So in other words, Allah Jalla wa Ala will make the Quran plain to the people through the tongue of the Prophet. And so Ibn Abbas says that when Jibreel would come down, the Prophet would simply lower his head, and when Jibreel would leave, the Prophet would be able to recite it as if he has been memorizing it, just as Allah had promised him. So in this narration we learn that you do not make haste in reciting the Quran. We can learn a valuable lesson here for the student of knowledge. Do not make haste in seeking knowledge. Rather, it is upon Allah to teach you this deen. As he says, عَلَّمَ الْإِنسَانَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ. He taught man what he did not know. So do not make haste when it comes to reciting the Quran, when it comes to seeking knowledge and all good things. Do not make haste, because the ajla, or the haste, is from shaitan. In English we have the proverb, more haste, less speed. And this is certainly true. Do not make haste, because it will slow you down. And we also learn that this Quran is not something which the Prophet made up. Rather, it is something which he heard from Jibreel, and something which Jibreel heard from Allah Jalla wa Ala. So the words ultimately come from Allah, and they do not come from the Prophet ﷺ. As for the writing of the Quran, then of course the Prophet had scribes like Zayd ibn Thabit who wrote the Quran down after it was recited. Also we learn it is Allah's responsibility to make the Quran plain to the people, so it is understandable. And he did this via the tongue of the Prophet. Now of course there are many people who do not understand the Quran properly. However, there is no part of the Quran which is unclear or is not understood. So if you have a knowledgeable person who does not understand some parts of the Quran, it does not mean that that part of the Quran is not understandable. Rather, there will always be people who understand the Quran properly. So that there is nothing in the Quran which is unclear or ambiguous. Because as Allah has promised, it is His responsibility to make the Quran plain and to make it understandable. Okay, which one is better? Al-Hadh, which is to recite it fast, or At-Tartil, which is to recite it slowly? And the answer is, to recite it slowly is better, as Allah Jalla wa Ala commands us, وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا. And it is also better for the understanding and pondering over the Quran. As for reciting it quickly, then we do not say it is haram, but it can become haram if you recite it so quickly so as to change the letters and meaning of the words. Otherwise it is not haram, but then again, not favored either. Hadith 231 from Ibn Abbas, he says, the Prophet did not recite the Quran to the jinn, and neither did he see them. He says that the Prophet went off to the market of Uqadh with a group of his companions, and so what happened was that the shayateen would go up into the sky to listen to what Allah has decreed, and this would be their usual practice. However, one day they were blocked from doing so because flames or shooting stars would drive them away. So these shayateen returned to their people, and the rest of them asked, what happened to you? And they said that we have been blocked off from listening to the news from the heavens, and that shuhub, or flames, or we could say shooting stars, were sent against us. And so the jinn said that this event could only happen due to something special happening on this earth. So go out to the east of the earth and to the west of the earth, meaning all throughout the earth, and take a look at what new event has taken place, which has led to us being blocked off from the news of the heavens. And so they did. They went off to the east and to the west of the earth until a group of the jinn came across the Prophet, and he was praying near a date palm tree with his companions, and the prayer was Salatul Fajr. So when they heard the Quran, they stopped and listened to it. And so in response they said, "This is what has come in between us and the news of the heavens." So they went back to their people and they said, "Ya qawmana, inna sami'na Qur'anan ajaba yahdi ila rushdi fa'amanna bih wa lan nushrika bi rabbina ahada." O our people, we have heard a wondrous recitation which guides to the right path, and we have acknowledged and submitted to it, and we will not commit shirk with our Lord. And so in response to this, Allah Jalla wa Ala sent down to the Prophet, قُلْ أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ أَنَّهُ اسْتَمَعَ نَفَرٌ مِّنَ الْجِنِّ. And that's the first ayah of Surah Al-Jinn. So we can take from this narration that the jinn are able to hear things, and they're of course able to hear humans. We can take that Salat al-Fajr is recited out aloud and not silently. And we can take that from the jinn are those who do want to be guided and have the intelligence which enables them to accept the guidance. We can also take that the Salat al-Jama'ah is legislated even on a journey, because here the Prophet and the companions were on a journey. And prior to this, the jinn, the believers from them anyway, would have been following the revelation of Musa alayhi salam. And when they saw the Prophet, they would have recognized him from the revelations of Musa alayhi salam, because the Prophet has been mentioned in the previous scriptures sent down by Allah Jalla wa Ala. Not just the Prophet, but also his companions have been mentioned in the previous scriptures. We find from this narration that from the jinn are those who are believers, and from the jinn are those who are disbelievers. And because there are believers and disbelievers from the jinn, then we can also say that from the jinn there will be those entering Jannah and those entering Jahannam, just like from the ins. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَجَعَلَ النَّاسَ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلِفِينَ إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ لَأَمْلَأَنَّ جَهَنَّمَ مِنَ الْجِنَّةِ وَالنَّاسِ أَجْمَعِينَ. If your Lord so willed, He could have made people into one nation, meaning everybody is a believer. But they will not cease to disagree, meaning some will accept the faith and some will not. But they will not cease to disagree except those on whom Allah has mercy on, meaning except the believers. They will not disagree with the truth and the guidance. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. And for this He has created them. So He has created them to separate between the believers and the disbelievers, and to show mercy to the believers and no mercy to the disbelievers. And the words of your Lord have been fulfilled, that I, meaning Allah, will surely fill Jahannam with the jinn and man altogether. So it proves that both the jinn and man will be in Jahannam. And we're talking about the disbelievers from them, of course, as well as the sinful believers from them, but they will be taken out eventually. As for the evidence that the jinn will also be in Jannah, because some people do deny it, they deny the fact that the jinn will be in Jannah, but we have evidence. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَلِمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ جَنَّتَانِ فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. And for the one who fears the standing before his Lord, there will be two gardens. So which of the blessings of your Lord will you deny? And the address here is for both the jinn and mankind, because the dual format is used. And from this also we learn of the incredible effect that the Quran can have, not just on the jinn but also on humans as well, as we can witness even up to this day and age, that when you read or listen to the Quran, it has such an effect that you embrace Islam. And of course this depends on the condition of your heart. So if you have a heart which is looking for guidance, you will accept Islam. But if you have a heart which is content with the pleasures of this world and you're not particularly looking for guidance, then the Quran will have no effect on you. Hadith 232. Alqamah, one of the Tabi'een, he asks Ibn Mas'ud, was one of you, meaning the companions, with the Prophet on the night of the jinn? Ibn Mas'ud replies, no, but I was with the Prophet that night. We were out with him and we lost him. And so we searched for him in the valleys and the mountain pathways. We could not find him. And so some of them thought that perhaps the jinn have taken him and flown away with him, or perhaps he has been secretly killed or assassinated. And so he says, we spent our worst night that night, because of this worry that they had in their minds. And when the next morning came, we found him in front of the cave of Hira, and they said, O Messenger of Allah, we lost you and we tried to look for you, but we couldn't find you. and we spent the worst night we could possibly imagine. And so the Prophet said, أتاني داعي الجن فذهبت معه فقرأت عليهم القرآن. He says that a da'i or a caller from the jinn came to me, and I went with him and recited the Quran to the jinn, meaning the jinn population. And so Ibn Mas'ud says that the Prophet took us and he showed us the effects or the marks left behind by the jinn, and they were fiery marks. And the jinn asked the Prophet about their provision, and the Prophet told them, لَكُمْ كُلُّ عَظْمٍ ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ يَقَعُ في أيديكم أوفر ما يكون لحما وكل بعرة علف لدوابكم. He says, every bone in which the name of Allah has been mentioned, which falls in your hands, it will be the meatiest thing you will eat, and every dung would be fodder for your animals, meaning the animals of the jinn. And so the Prophet ﷺ told his companions, فَلَا تَسْتَنْجُوا بِهِمَا فَإِنَّهُمَا طَعَامُ إِخْوَانِكُمْ. So do not make istinja from them, meaning the bones nor the dung, because they are food of your brothers, meaning your brothers from the jinn, so the believing jinn. So this narration of Ibn Mas'ud is a different scenario to the one mentioned by Ibn Abbas. In the narration of Ibn Abbas, the scholars have differed. Did the Prophet know that the jinn were listening to him as he was reciting in the Salat al-Fajr? So there's a difference there. But this narration is quite different because he is now reciting to the jinn. So of course he knows that the jinn are listening to him. We learn something about the jinn here, that they eat and that they also have their animals. And we need to be careful when we speak about the jinn, because first and foremost we must understand that the jinn are from the unseen, and so we do not speak about matters of the unseen at all unless we have evidence to do so. We learn that the animal which has been sacrificed and the name of Allah has been mentioned, then the bone of this animal would be food for the jinn. Of course, it's not food for humans because they don't eat bones. One might say, but we do not see any meat on these bones, so how can these bones be the meatiest thing that the jinn eat? Well, we simply say that this is the matter of the unseen. So for the jinn, they are meat, but for you, they are not meat, it is just bones. We also find that the bone and the dung are not to be used to make istinja, because if the bone has the name of Allah mentioned over it, then it is food for the jinn. If it did not have the name of Allah mentioned over it, then according to many scholars, it is najis, and you're not allowed to make istinja with something which is najis. As for the dung, then this is the food for the animal of the jinn, and you do not make istinja from it. Even if this dung is tahir, for example, the dropping of camels or cows, and these animals are halal to eat, so their excrement is tahir, it is not najis. But still, all types of dung is going to be fodder for the animals of the jinn, therefore you do not make istinja from it. We also find that the jinn are bound by rules of the sharia. So certain foods are halal for them, others are not. And we're talking about the believing jinn here. We cannot say that every single rule of the sharia which applies to us applies to them, because they are in their very nature extremely different to human beings, and we find even within human beings the sharia laws change. So the sharia for an insane person is not the same as that of a sane person. One for a child is not the same as for a grown-up adult. And even between males and females, the ruling of the sharia changes. For example, menstruation and so on. So even within humans, we have a changing of the rules. So how about then between humans and jinn? That change would be ever more pronounced. And this is the opinion of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, that the sharia for the jinn is not the same as the sharia for humans. And this appears to be a sensible opinion. Sure, there could be similarities in that both are required to worship Allah, but how is this worship done, and the details of it is likely to be different. And so what we need to know is that the world of the jinn is a world separate to ours, and there mustn't be any intermingling in between, because this is possible. It is possible to make use of the jinn, and the scholars have differed as to whether it's permissible to make use of the jinn in permissible affairs. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah says it is permissible, because the companions acknowledged this during the time of Umar ibn Khattab. A woman would have jinn serving her, and they missed Umar. He was gone somewhere and they didn't know where he was, so this woman sent out a jinn to look for him, and the jinn came back and told her that he is tending to the camels of the sadaqah. But of course we have to be careful because a jinn is not likely to be of any service to you unless you give him a share of your worship. And that of course is kufr. Hadith number 233 from Abu Qatada. He says that the Prophet would pray with us, and in the Dhuhr and Asr, in the first 2 rak'at, he would recite Surah Al-Fatiha and then a surah after it, and sometimes he would make us hear the recitation. So in other words, it is a silent recitation, but sometimes with a few ayat here and there, he would make the companions hear what he is reciting. And he would lengthen the first rak'ah of the Dhuhr, and he would make the second rak'ah shorter than the first, and the same he would do with the Salat al-Subh. First is longer, second is shorter. So in this narration we learn something about the recitation of the Dhuhr and Asr. So we learn that they are both silent prayers, because he says that sometimes the Prophet would make them hear what he is reciting, which means that normally they would not hear what he is reciting. And this is a forgotten sunnah, because normally you find the A'immah just reciting silently, whereas the sunnah is that sometimes you make them hear what you are reciting with a few ayat here and there. And it is better to recite a whole surah after the Fatiha rather than part of the surah, although the issue is flexible, because ultimately you recite what is easy for you. What is apparent from the narration here is that in the last 2 rak'at, he would not recite a surah after Al-Fatiha. However, in the same chapter, a narration from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says, we would estimate how long the Prophet would recite for in the Dhuhr and Asr, and we estimated his standing position in the first 2 rak'at of Dhuhr to be the length of Alif Lam Mim Tanzil As-Sajda, that's Surah As-Sajda, which is 30 ayat long. And in the last 2 rak'at, we estimated his standing position to be half that amount. So that would be approximately 15 ayat long. And we estimated the first 2 rak'at of his Salat al-Asr to be the same length as the last 2 rak'at of the Salat al-Dhuhr. So in other words, about 15 ayat long. And the last 2 rak'at of Asr to be half the length of the first 2 rak'at of Al-Asr. So from this narration, it appears that in the last 2 rak'at of Dhuhr, the Prophet would be reciting after Al-Fatiha. Remember, Al-Fatiha is 7 ayat long, and they estimated his last 2 rak'at of Dhuhr to be about 15 ayat long. And in the narration of Abu Qatada, he says that in the last 2 rak'at of Dhuhr and Asr, the Prophet would recite only Al-Fatiha. So it appears that Abu Qatada's narration is much more direct and more certain than Abu Sa'id's narration, because with Abu Sa'id they are just estimating, whereas Abu Qatada is not estimating, he is giving us a definitive statement. So that is more worthy for us to take. Having said that, however, if somebody was to recite a surah after Al-Fatiha in the last 2 rak'at of Dhuhr or Asr, then we would not have any problem with that. But the usual practice is not to do that. And it makes more sense also to lengthen the first rak'ah, because firstly, when you first enter into the prayer, you are most energetic. And so it makes more sense therefore to lengthen the first rak'ah, because you'll be more focused. And then as the prayer goes on, you tend to lose focus a bit more, so it makes more sense to shorten the latter part of the salah. And then the second benefit would be that many people in the first rak'ah are likely to be making wudu or just finishing off the wudu. So if you lengthen this rak'ah, then it gives them the chance to catch the first rak'ah. In another narration of this chapter, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says about the Salat al-Dhuhr, he says that the Dhuhr would be established and one of us would go towards Al-Baqi' cemetery and relieve himself, meaning not in the cemetery but towards that direction, meaning around that cemetery. And then he would go back to his family and make wudu, and then he would return and the Prophet would still be in the first rak'ah. So we can see then that the first rak'ah of Dhuhr is lengthened, and this gives a chance for the people to join the first rak'ah after they relieve themselves and make wudu, or finish off making their wudu. Hadith 234 from Abdullah ibn Sa'ib. He says that the Prophet led us in the Salat al-Subh prayer in Mecca. And he says that he began the recitation with Surah Al-Mu'minun, this is after Al-Fatiha of course, until he reached the place where Musa and Harun are mentioned, or where Isa alayhi salam is mentioned. One of the narrators, he forgets exactly which one of the two it was, And then he says at that time the Prophet started to cough, so he broke off the recitation and went into ruku'. In another narration of the chapter from Amr ibn Hurayth, he says that he heard the Prophet recite in the Fajr Salah, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا عَسْعَسْ, meaning that's Surah At-Takwir. And also in the same chapter, the Prophet recited Qaf wal-Qur'an al-Majid. So from this narration we learn Surah Al-Qaf was recited in the first rak'ah of the Subh. Also in the chapter from Jabir ibn Samurah, he says that in the Salat al-Dhuhr, the Prophet recited Sabbih isma rabbika la'ala, and in the Subh he recited something longer than that. However, we say that this Dhuhr was not a loud recitation. Rather, we know sometimes the Prophet would make it aloud so they could hear him, but the regular practice was that the Dhuhr and Asr are not allowed, and this is a consensus. Also from Abu Barzah, he says that in the Salat al-Ghada, the morning prayer, meaning the Fajr, the Prophet would recite from 60 to 100 ayat. So clearly we see that it is a longer recitation. So we find from these narrations that the Salat al-Subh is meant to be a longer recitation. Of course, sometimes you can make it into a shorter recitation. For example, we know of the evidence where in both the raka'at of the Salat al-Subh, the Prophet recited Surah Az-Zalzalah. And that's a short surah, of course, and he recited it in both raka'at, which means that you can recite the same surah in both raka'at as well, although this is not the usual practice, but it would not be haram if you did so. And likewise, it would not be haram if you recited a shorter surah in the subh as well, although this is not the usual practice. Also, we find there's no problem in stopping your recitation midway in the surah, as the Prophet did here with Surah Al-Mu'minun, and this would be due to a genuine reason, like you suffering a cough. Otherwise, the better way is to complete the surah. And we also find that the usual practice of a subh is that you recite between 60 and 100 ayat. So you can see that it is quite a long salah. Is it permissible to recite part of a surah in a rak'ah? The answer is yes. We have direct evidence. For example, the Prophet prayed Salat al-Maghrib and he recited Surah Al-A'raf, dividing it between the two rak'at. Also in Sahih Muslim, in Salat al-Subh, he recited قُولُوا آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ, and in the second rak'ah, آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَاشْهَدْ بِأَنَّا مُسْلِمُونَ. So one is in Surah Al-Baqarah, the other one in Al-Imran. Hadith 235 from Fadl bint al-Harith. She says that she heard the Prophet ﷺ reciting وَالْمُرْسَلَاتُ عُرْفًا in Surah Al-Maghrib. Also in the chapter we find that the Prophet recited At-Tur in the Salat al-Maghrib. Now these surah are from the Tiwalul Mufassal, from the longer surahs in the Mufassal. The Mufassal surah are from Surah Qaf up till Mursalat, so these are the longer ones. Then the Awsat, the middle ones from the Mufassal, are from Surah An-Naba to Al-Layl inclusively, and then the shorter ones, the Qisarul Mufassal, are from Surah Ad-Duha till the end. And they are called Mufassal, separated out, because separations between these surah are more frequent than those surah before them. So in Maghrib, the usual practice is to recite from the Qisarul Mufassal. However, sometimes you could recite from other surah as well. So it's much more flexible. Because certainly we see that Mursalat and At-Tur are from the longer surah, they're not from the Qisarul Mufassal. We also know that the Prophet recited Surah Al-A'raf in the Maghrib Salah. He split it between the two rak'at in which you recite out aloud. Hadith 236 from Al-Bara, he says, he was praying Salat al-Isha behind the Prophet, and in one of the rak'at, the Prophet recited وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ. The normal practice for Salat al-Isha is that you recite from the middle ones of the Mufassal. But here, At-Teen is from the shorter ones of the Mufassal, so you can recite from other than the Awsatul Mufassal, and the issue is flexible. And in the chapter, Jabir narrates that Mu'adh ibn Jabal would pray the Isha behind the Prophet, then he would go to his own community and lead them in prayer in the Salat al-Isha, and he would make the recitation very long. And one of the people in his congregation split off from the Jama'ah and prayed by himself. When Mu'adh got to know about this, he accused him of being a munafiq, and to this the man went to the Prophet and complained that he was being accused by Mu'adh ibn Jabal of being a munafiq. Of course, being accused of being a munafiq is not a light accusation, it is immensely defamatory. And so the Prophet went to Mu'adh ibn Jabal and he told him, أَتُرِيدُ أَن تَكُونَ فَتَّانًا يَا مُعَاذ? Do you want to be someone who puts others to trials, O Mu'adh? إِذَا أَمَمْتَ النَّاسَ فَاقْرَأْ بِالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَسَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى وَاقْرَأْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى. When you lead the people in prayer, then you should recite وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا, or سَبِّحِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى, or اقْرَأْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ, or وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى. Meaning these types of surah which are from the middle surah of the Mufassal, so that it does not cause hardship upon the people following behind you. So you have to look after the people you are praying in front of when you're the Imam. Also we find then that a person praying a nafilah can lead the one praying a fard prayer. We have further evidence from Amr ibn Salama. He was about 6 or 7 years old when he led his people because he knew more of the Quran than anyone else. Now the prayer of a 7-year-old is not going to be a fard prayer. It is going to be a nafilah. But those praying behind him will be praying a fard prayer. So it is permissible for a mutanaffil to lead a muftarid. We also take that it is permissible for a member of the jama'ah to leave the jama'ah for a valid excuse, whether it be a shara'i excuse or a physical excuse. A physical excuse would be that he has to relieve himself, but the imam is taking a little long, so he cuts off from the jama'ah, he completes the prayer by himself and goes to relieve himself. A shara'i excuse would be that the imam is simply taking too long and is causing difficulty, so you can leave him. And in this narration we have a clear-cut evidence of this, because the Prophet did not rebuke the man for leaving the jama'ah, rather he rebuked Mu'adh ibn Jabal for making the salah too long. Hadith 237. From Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says that a man came to the Prophet and he complained to the Prophet that I do not join the Salat al-Subh in the jama'ah because of such and such a person. When he leads the prayer, he makes the prayer far too long. Abu Sa'id says that I never saw the Prophet so angry when giving a sermon like I saw him that day. He said to the people, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna minkum munaffirin, فأيكم أما الناس فليوجز فإن من ورائه الكبير والضعيف وذا الحاجة. O people, from you there are those who are making others averse to this deen. When one of you leads the people in prayer, then let him make the prayer succinct, because behind him there are those who are elderly, weak, and those who have a need to attend to. And in another narration from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said in the same chapter, إِذَا أَمَّ أَحَدُكُمُ النَّاسَ فَلْيُخَفِّفْ فَإِنَّ فِيهِمْ الصَّغِيرَ وَالْكَبِيرَ وَالضَّعِيفَ وَالْمَرِيضَ فَإِذَا صَلَّ وَحْدَهُ فَلْيُصَلِّ كَيْفَ شَاءَ. When one of you leads the people in prayer, then let him make the prayer light, because behind him there are those who are of young age, of elderly age, those who are weak and those who are ill. And when you pray by yourself, then you can pray however you want to. And also in the same chapter, Anas ibn Malik says that I never prayed behind anyone who was lighter nor more complete in his prayer than the Prophet. So here we learn that it is permissible to get angry when you are giving a preaching. But this type of anger is not severe anger, it is just moderate type of anger. And when we talk about making the prayer light as you are leading, then what do we mean by light? We mean following the sunnah. This is a light prayer. As Anas says that nobody was lighter in his prayer nor more complete than the Prophet. So we say following the sunnah is when you keep the prayer light and succinct. This is how we define it. We don't leave the definition to the whims of the people. And from this we learn that you must give due consideration to other people, because your actions and statements do have an effect on them. So you need to give this consideration and you must have empathy. This is the Muslim's way. And also, do not be so quick to conclude that somebody is a munafiq, because it could be that you are in the wrong, or that your judgment is based on unauthentic evidence and sources. So let's take an example. We know the sunnah, if you lead the Salat al-Jumu'ah, is that in the first rak'ah you recite Sabbih isma rabbika al-a'la, and in the second, Hal ataka hadithul ghashiyah. Or another sunnah is, in the first you recite Surat al-Jumu'ah, and in the second, Surat al-Munafiqun. So this is the sunnah. Now if somebody complains and he says, your lengthening the salah too much and you're reciting a surah which is too long, and the sunnah is to make it short, then in this case he is wrong and you are in the right, because the one who is following the sunnah, he is in the right. So you can simply answer by saying, but who defines what a short salah is, or what a succinct salah is? Whose yardstick do we use? Well, we say the Muslim uses the yardstick of the sunnah, not that of the whims and desires of the people. Hadith 238, from Anas ibn Malik, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنِّي لَأَدْخُلُ فِي الصَّلَاةِ أُرِيدُ إِطَالَتَهَا فَأَسْمَعُ بُكَاءَ الصَّبِيِّ فَأُخَفِّفُ مِنْ شِدَّةِ وَجْدِ أُمِّهِ بِهِ. I enter the salah and I want to lengthen it. Then I hear a baby crying, and I make the salah shorter or lighter because of the severe compassion the mother of the child is going to have for her child. We take from this narration that the women would be praying in jama'ah behind the Prophet, and we have already discussed this issue and the evidences have preceded. We can also take that if in your salah you don't have complete khushu', because here the Prophet could not have had complete khushu' as he hears the baby crying and he is forced to change his course of action, then this, we say, does not harm the prayer. We also take from this narration the good character of the Prophet, in that he would be thinking about his companions.
So we find that the Prophet is sensitive to the feelings of his companions. And then besides, how can a person pray with a khushu' when his or her child is crying? Okay, let's take some review questions. Question number 1. Should women be prevented from coming to the masjid? Give the detail on this answer. Question number 2. What do we say about the bones and the dung in relation to the jinn? Question 3. What are the group of surahs called the mufassal? State the 3 types.